Welcome to the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie Betts. After learning a ton about kidney stones and helping people prevent stones at the University of Chicago, I was fed up with all the terrible advice people were finding online. So I decided to do something about it. The Kidney Dietitian was born. This podcast is for people who want to learn what actually works to prevent kidney stones and still enjoy life, eating, and their favorite foods. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome to the 56th episode of the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie Betts. And today we have probably a pretty short episode, but I think probably a very timely episode because, guys, it is hot out there. As many of you know, I live in Chicago. I grew up in Michigan, and I do not like the heat. So I am not cut out for these multiple stretches of days, 90 plus, in massive humidity here in the Midwest. I often joke that I moved to the South when I moved to Chicago from Michigan, which is obviously not true, depends on your perspective. But I do swear that it is hotter in Chicago. So that, you know, all of this being said, like, it is a hot summer, right? And it's been hot and is likely going to continue to get hotter, which actually has a really big impact on kidney stones, which I think is kind of fascinating. There's actually estimates that global warming is going to has and will continue to increase the prevalence of kidney stones worldwide. So that is not the best news for those of us out there that want to prevent stones. And it's pretty significant. They've used all sorts of computer models and whatnot, and they've estimated that just in the next 50 years, the prevalence of kidney stones is going to increase by about 10%. And that is just because of temperatures rising, which I think is absolutely fascinating. So why are kidney stones more likely when it's hot outside? I think the answer is likely pretty obvious. It's just simply because you sweat more, right? Like, when we think about kidney stone prevention, it really does just come down to what's coming out in your urine, because kidney stones form because of some chemical change in the supersaturation or the likelihood of that stone to form in your urine. And we are going to have calcium in our urine. There's literally no way to make it so that there's zero calcium in our urine. We're going to have oxalate in our urine. There's literally no way to make sure that you have zero oxalate in your urine, because even if you consumed a zero oxalate diet, which for the record, I absolutely do not recommend, that it would be massively harmful for kidney stone prevention and general health. But even if you did consume zero oxalate, there would still be some oxalate in your urine because your liver makes oxalate from a variety of things. So anyway, there's going to be these sort of stone-making materials in your urine no matter what, right? We do all sorts of things to help reduce how much oxalate and phosphate and, you know, all of these lithogenic materials in our urine. But oftentimes, stone prevention really just comes down to getting more urine, because if you have more urine, a greater volume of urine, those molecules are going to be less likely to bind because they're not as crowded in there, right? They're not as saturated, and they're less likely to form stones. And so if you're losing a fair amount of water through sweat, whether it's through exercise or simply because it's hotter outside, you're going to have more concentrated urine. That's what our bodies do, right? Our bodies are going to hold on to more water, or there's less water to come out in our urine, because our bodies want to make sure that our bodies are as hydrated as possible. That is why, right? Just we're losing that water through sweat, and we may not be thinking about replacing it with drinking even extra water above and beyond what we would typically recommend for kidney stone prevention. So that's really what it comes down to. I tried to find some estimates for us to see, like, how much greater risk are we of stones on these really hot days. And obviously it's really hard to come up with an actual number because it's influenced by so many different things, like how much time do you spend outside? Are you someone who does sweat a lot or not? Are you used to living in hotter areas, and all these types of things. But I did find one interesting study that looked back at temperatures and people who came to the emergency room or to the doctor with kidney stone symptoms It was a study that was done in South Carolina, actually, and they found that on days that were super, super hot, basically, men had about a 75% greater risk of presenting with a kidney stone, right? These kidney stones could have been hanging out in their bodies for a long time. It's really, really impossible to know exactly when kidney stones form unless we, take you in for a CT every single day of your life, which is obviously not feasible and would be dangerous for so many reasons. But at least 75% more men showed up, or they had a 75% greater risk of showing up to the ER with a stone the 10 days or so after a super hot day in South Carolina. Interestingly, the risk for women was much lower. It was only 15%, so perhaps there's something that makes men especially susceptible to the hot weather changes in our bodies and making them more predisposed to stones. We don't quite understand why that is, because women only had a 15% increased risk compared to that 75% increased risk for men. But either way, we know that there is definitely a risk of stones increased after these really hot days. And so that begs the question, what can we do about it, right? Like, we can't really make the temperature cooler, unfortunately. Unless you move, I guess that's not feasible. Like, you don't want to move just to reduce your risk of stones. That doesn't really make sense. So what can we do on these really hot days to negate that higher risk? And honestly, the answer comes down to just making sure you're hydrated, which is not exciting, but so much of kidney stone prevention, like I said, really, really comes down to making sure that you're producing enough urine, that those lithogenic materials, those stone-making materials that are inevitably going to be in your urine are as least concentrated as possible. So what can you do? I would recommend that when it is really hot outside, when, especially on these, dangerously hot days, when there's these heat warnings and all these types of things, that you drink extra water. Even if you don't go outside, drink more water. Of course, if you do go outside, and especially if you spend extra time outside, if you're doing yard work or exercising outside, please, 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 please make sure that you're drinking even more water, even above what we sort of our generic recommendation for kidney stone formers, which is 100 ounces of water per day. There's really no magic number of how much more water you should be drinking, but I do think maybe a good rule of thumb would be for every hour that you're outside in that extreme heat would be to drink an extra 8-ounce glass of water. Again, this is above and beyond that 100 fluid ounces of water that we typically recommend for most people with kidney stones. Of course, if you are outside running in that extreme heat, I would do even more, maybe double that, right? Maybe 16 ounces of extra. If you're running for an entire hour, 16 more ounces of water above and beyond that 100 fluid ounce recommendation. I think, there's groups of people that I'm especially concerned about in this heat. I'm concerned about everyone in the heat, but for those of us that live in dry heat, not me, here in the Midwest, we are all about humidity. But if you're in Arizona, Nevada, right, those areas that are notorious for their dry heat, you may not realize how much you're sweating. I don't know about you guys, but here in the Midwest, if I go outside and it is 95 degrees, I am sweating immediately, or you can feel it on your skin, right? So it just kind of reminds us oh, I'm losing this water. It's icky, or I need to drink more water. But apparently that doesn't happen. I cannot imagine a world without humidity. But apparently in other areas of the country and certainly other areas of the world, this does happen in this dry heat. And so I can imagine that in that dry heat, you're not really reminded of oh gosh, I'm really losing all of this water via my sweat. I should drink more. So I think that I would be really worried about those people, especially since those areas of the country and of the world obviously get even hotter than here in Chicago on average, right? It is not unheard of to be above 110 degrees. And so I think those areas I would be especially concerned. Another thing that I think puts you at greater risk is if you are in the water. So if you are swimming in a pool or a lake, you are still sweating, right? You're still in the sun, oftentimes for a very long time. I love swimming and being in lakes and on boats. That is definitely my happy place. So I could be out there all day easily. And so when you are jumping in and out of the water, it's likely cooler, right? But you're still in the sun. You're still sweating. You're still losing that moisture from your skin with the breeze and whatnot. And so I think, again, you just maybe don't realize it because you're not just sweating and feeling icky in the heat because you're having so much fun swimming and just feeling cool. And that might not sort of trigger your mind to think, oh, yes, I should drink more water. So even if you aren't dying in the heat and you're having a lovely time swimming in a lake or a pool, definitely make sure that you replace that likely lost water by drinking more water that day. Another thing that makes especially this swimming fun summer situation potentially a little bit more dangerous for stone formers is if we add alcohol to the mix. Not saying, of course, that you cannot have alcohol. There's no reason that people with kidney stones cannot enjoy an adult beverage from time to time. Of course, we should limit it to what the CDC says is moderate drinking, which is 1 drink per day for women or 2 drinks for men. But I do think that in the summer, maybe we are out at a friend's barbecue or cookout or enjoying some drinks on a boat or something like that, right? If you're drinking all that alcohol, that's going to make you potentially less likely to be drinking water because you're having a great time and you're just not thinking about drinking water. And so I think that could maybe make this whole situation a little bit worse. That being said, alcohol is fluid. It does technically count towards our fluid goals, but obviously most of the fluid that we drink shouldn't be alcohol. We really should be making sure that we are drinking water, especially when we are drinking alcohol, because I feel like oftentimes you're drinking something, and if you're drinking a drink, you may not be drinking that water. Another thing about these fun summer situations is that oftentimes we may be eating a lot more salt, right, than we typically would be, because I feel like many of the traditional summer foods like hot dogs and potato chips, potato salad, and these types of things are pretty high in salt, which means you likely are eating more salt than you may be used to eating, which, as we all know, for a day or two is completely fine. There's no reason that you can't enjoy a hot dog or have potato chips or whatever, but especially if you're doing this a lot, and especially when all of this extra salt is combined with a really, really hot day, you can see how that could be kind of a recipe for disaster, because we now have more concentrated urine, and then likely our urine calcium is going to skyrocket. That might be dramatic, is going to go up at least a little bit. For some of us, it could skyrocket because of all that extra sodium that we're eating. And so, we're kind of creating this perfect storm. And so I would say that especially if you, this is not like if you're out for a couple of minutes, but if you're out for a long time, right? You were out at a party or a barbecue, or you went on a really long run, I would be mindful of extra water for the next couple days, right? It's not really just that day, because whatever we do one day is probably going to kind of have lingering effects over the next 1 to 2 days. In fact, that study from South Carolina that I mentioned about trying to see how much greater the risk of stones was for people after a really hot day, it seems like around 2 days after a super hot day was kind of the peak of when people would present with kidney stone symptoms. And so that tells me that there's, and physiologically it certainly makes sense, that maybe we want to be mindful of drinking a lot of extra water the next 1 to 2 days after you spend a lot of time out in that heat, or if after a really, really hot day. So hopefully that helps give you some ideas of what we can do to prevent stones. I just think it's fascinating to think about, that there is this pretty significant increased risk of stones just because of higher temperatures, both looking at it from a big lens of this global warming thing, but also just from one single hot day does cause kind of a spike in kidney stone symptoms and people presenting to the emergency room with kidney stones. And so I think that definitely warrants some extra attention to kidney stone prevention on those days when it's really, really hot, which ultimately means we just have to drink more water. Guys, I've talked for 10 minutes, and the bottom line is we just need to drink more water. Not surprising, but so, so important. I had to dedicate an entire podcast episode to it. So hopefully this was helpful. If it's a really, really hot day where you are today, go and get an extra glass of water. Drink those extra 8 ounces to make up for that lost water through all of that sweat, because it's so, so hot out there. With that, I will close this episode of the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you for listening to today's episode. For more help with kidney stones, check out my website, www.thekidneydietitian.org. For more personalized help from me, check out my online course, Kidney Stone Nutrition School. VIP enrollment includes help directly from me. I can't wait to see you there and help you prevent kidney stones. Have a great day.